And we're back. Welcome, guys. Well done for making it this far. In today's tutorials, we're going to be talking about functions in Python. So a function is a block of code which only runs when it is called. You can pass data known as parameters into a function, and a function can always return a data as a result. How do we create a function? We can create a function using the def keyword, then the name of the function. I'm going to call this function my function, for instance. Then I would pass an empty parameter for now. Then I would end the function declaration with the column. Then the next line of code, which is indented in the function, is going to be the action that will be executed when I call on the function, which is going to be print. Let's call this, let's print to the console. Let's just say hello from a function. So now this is the basic syntax of how you can create a function in Python. Now the next thing we're going to be looking at is how do we call this function to print it to the terminal for the users to see. So to call a function, we have to come to a new line, backspace to prevent you from running in the same function code. Then we'll just call the function name. So the name of the function is here, my function. So I will just call this on a different line with the empty parentheses. Then I run it on the console. I should be seeing hello from a function in the console. So this is how you can create a function, then call the function in the code. Now let's talk about arguments. Information can be passed into functions using arguments. Arguments are specified after the function's name inside the parentheses, that's inside this parentheses after the function declaration. You can assign many arguments as you want, but you have to separate your arguments by commas. So I'm going to show you how to pass arguments into the function we just defined here. I want to pass in, for instance, my last name. I'll call the argument lname for short. Now I want to use this last name in my function and print it to the console. Hi, and my last name should be printed to the console. So let me clean this up and do that. So the last name is going to be passed like this, L name. Now, whenever I want to call on this function, I have to pass in the last name to the function. Clear this up. That was a mistake. So now I want to call this last name on my function. I will call it like this, passing it my last name. Then whenever I call this function, it's going to call my last name in the return statement, hello Umo. So let's run that. We have hello Umo. Let's give some space for clarity. And hello Umo, we have that here. One more space here to be sure. Okay, so now this is how you can pass arguments. You can pass multiple arguments into this function. Okay, I want to add my, okay, if I want to add my my first name, I can still go with first name and I would add it like so. Call it my first name. Then once I run this to the console again, I will pass in my first name also to the console. My first name is MacDave. Then when I run this to the console, I should see hello Umo MacDave. I can add spaces here to make my code clean. Then it should be coming out clean then. Hello, Umar MacDave. So this is how we can go about adding arguments into our function. You just pass in the arguments you want in your function name declaration on line 1 here. Then if you're going to use 2, you can as well write the second one after the comma. Then you can use them like this in your return statement from your function, which is just to print hello, my name and my last name to the console. So this is how you can go about it. I can still have this same function, repeat this code for someone new. So I can say, okay, I want to create for another friend of mine, Anne Jacob. Let's just say this is her name and last name. So when I run this to the console, this same code is going to print hello Anne Jacob. So you can see how a function, as we earlier said, is a block of reusable code. Whenever we call this function, it's going to execute the same code we wanted to execute, but with different parameters that we have assigned. So let's explain the terminologies and how they relate with one another. Let's look at the term parameters and arguments. So the term parameter and arguments can be used for the same thing. That's being information that is passed into the function. So from the function's perspective, that's from this side of the function, A parameter is a variable listed inside the function, while the argument is the value that is sent to the function when it is called. That's the function side of things. Okay, so for the function, it takes this argument we're sending here as a parameter, then the value we're sending into the argument, it takes it as the argument itself. So sometimes you can get them interswitched, but that's just basically the meaning from the function side of things. Now let's look at passing arguments into a function. By default, a function must be called with the correct number of arguments, meaning that if your function expects 2 arguments, you have to call the arguments like we have done here. It has to be 2 arguments because I have sent in 2 arguments from the onset. But if, for instance, I pass in another argument here, I will have an error that tells me that it is expecting just 2 arguments. I am passing 3. So let me run this in the console and show you so you can see the error message. I'm going to run this now. So you see my error message here. My function takes 2 positional arguments, but 3 were given. So for arguments, the number of arguments you pass should be the number of arguments that your code should be expecting. No more, no less. Now I'm going to show you guys how to set a default parameter value. So what do I mean by default parameter value? So in the event that none of the users pass in a value to the function and the function is expecting a value, you can set a default parameter value for the function to use that default variable and print to the console. So a default parameter value would look like this. If, for instance, the user does not put his name here and the name is expected when it is being called, I can just simply come here and set a default parameter value by assigning unknown, or I would just use John Doe as my default parameter value. So my last name should be John, and then the first name should be Doe. So when I run this code without passing arguments to the code should still work fine without requiring me to input some arguments. When I run this to the console, let me clear this error up. Then I clear my console. And I run it back. So you can see on my last line of code, I have hello John Doe when I did not pass any argument into this function name on line 6. So we can have default parameters set in Python to use on our functions name to return certain values by default to the console when none is passed by the user. So we can also have a return statement added to our function name to return a particular value whenever the function is being declared and called. So let me clear this up and let's have a simple function that just does a minor multiplication problem. So I'm going to write a new function here, def call it mul for multiply. Then I'm going to pass in one argument that it should be expecting. Then I would return using the return keyword. I can tell my function to return every time I pass in this argument, return some calculation. So I want to multiply whatever my user sends to me by 5. So I'm going to add that argument here. So when I call on this mul, I should pass in one argument. I'm going to pass in 3. Then when I run this in the console, for every time I run, I'm going to give you another one to give you a clear explanation. I'm going to pass in 6 here. So for every time I run this code, it's just going to multiply return. So we're going to start from after the mul. So now for every time I run this code, I want to print this to the console. So I can just add my print statement here. Print. Then for this to, or let me just copy this and paste. Change this to 6. Then I clear this up. So for every time I run this code, I want the user to see a multiplication of 5 by the number he passed into me. So I'm going to run this code. I have 20 and 30. So for every time the user sends in an integer here, this mul function is going to return the multiplication of that number by 5. So this is how we can use a return statement in Python. So I've showed you guys how to define a Python function, how to pass in arguments to the function like we did on line 1, how to set in default parameters, and how to print that function to the console using the print keyword in the function. So you can call the function again with the function name with the parentheses afterwards. Then you can also use a return statement on the function if you want to return a certain action to the code to the function every time the function is called. So basically, we don't have much for functions. We can only perform certain operations on function, but the beautiful thing about function is that we can use it multiple times for a different part of our code. So we don't need to now write that same code over and over again. We can just use the function to set in the code we want to use, and for every time we call that code, it's going to come out the way we want it. So this is it for Python functions. Next, we're going to be looking at objects and classes in Python and how we can use them in Python.